Hello and a very warm welcome back indeed to those that have just joined us at the DAL Global Virtual Summit, Leading, Winning and Wellbeing through Inclusion in Response to COVID-19. Hello and welcome to those who are in the US. Good morning, in fact, and good afternoon to the UK and our European friends on this side of the globe. Our seventh panel of the day is entitled Leveraging the Power of Data Analytics and Social Engagement to Drive Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging Behaviours across 21st century modern organisations. We're joined by three superb leaders, all passionate about changing the game of diversity, inclusion and belonging. And I'm delighted now to welcome to the DAL Global Virtual Stage, Gavin Lewis, Managing Director at BlackRock, Ian Workman, Managing Director, Head SME UK at Barclays, and Sanjay Bandari, Chair of Kick It Out. We are going to hear from our industry leaders on how and why data analytics and social engagement is crucial to drive the future of diversity, inclusion and belonging strategies in a globally interconnected world. But before we get into the mechanics of this session, we'd love to hear some introductions into your personal and professional backgrounds and any specific insights into why you're all so truly passionate about diversity, inclusion and belonging. Gavin, I'm going to come to you first.
Hi everyone, can you hear me clearly? Yeah, thumbs up.
We can.
Brilliant. Okay, so before I say anything, I don't speak for every black person in the UK. Before I get any comments that saying that, you can't say that because I don't agree with you. So let's just get that clear. These are my views, not your views. And secondly, if you hear any screaming, those are probably my kids, my two daughters. I don't have a torture chamber buried in the in my basement. So why is this important to me? It's important to me because I work in the asset management industry, and it's fantastic industry, but it probably isn't as representative in terms of ethnic minority representation as it could be. I grew up in Tottenham, in the inner city. On a council estate, and to have a career similar to the one that I have now just wasn't something that you even knew existed, let alone feel that you could actually do. So I've got to a position now where I have a voice and I have a platform, and I think I have a responsibility to show other people that it can be done, but also discuss the issues so that if they do enter the industry, that they actually have a chance of succeeding and progressing.
Many thanks indeed, Gavin. And don't worry, for all those listening, we're absolutely sure that you do not represent every single black person in the UK or the wider world, in fact. So Sanjay, to you.
Yeah, hi. So especially from a career perspective, I had I don't know how to describe what I currently do, maybe a portfolio career. Often I describe myself as unemployed. I had a sort of 30-year career in professional services, sort of a lawyer, then sort of switched to technology, legal technology, compliance technology, building markets teams, building businesses, then innovation. And yeah, now I'm doing this portfolio career mostly for the last year, having a year off and trying to enjoy myself. But my idea of fun was taking up a few charity roles, which included becoming the new chair of Kick It Out. So I'm only the second chair of Kick It Out in its 27-year history, which is the UK football's leading anti-discrimination charity. Why am I interested in this? I suppose I had 12 years doing a side hustle. I was a partner at EY. My side hustle was being involved in our diversity and inclusion activities and leading our race strategy. And actually a similar background to Gavin, actually. I grew up on a council estate in Wolverhampton. I don't speak for every one of the 4 or 5+ million Asian people in this country in the same way that Gavin doesn't speak for every black person, much as though when you do speak, particularly on social media, people assume that's what assume that is your constituency. So yeah, I actually often think people from my background, I don't see even many people like that. As I've got progressively through my career, if you took a sort of Sergeant Pepper album of everyone in my life for every year from when I was 5 years old, that background would become progressively more white and male. it looks like, and now it looks like a sight screen. Because when I was a kid, there were loads of Black and Asian kids in my class at school, and as I got higher up in the city, you just didn't see them.
And I think that's absolutely representative, I dare say, of the vast majority of organisations. And, whilst I, personally didn't grow up in a council estate, I can absolutely empathise with being different when younger. My brother and I were the only Chinese children in the school, other than my friend who was half Chinese, and I was drawn instantaneously to her, interestingly. And we grew up in Harrogate in North Yorkshire, which is quite possibly one of the most middle-class kind of working, white towns in the north of England. But anyhow, Ian, love to hear from you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and great to be here. So, look, I guess I've got a bit of a different background to everybody, but also very similar. So, my background, I was born in Newport in South Wales, in a very working class town. Mum worked in Marks and Spencers, and Dad had a little business as a piano tuner. And it's really interesting as I've progressed in my career how people's perceptions of my background have changed with my role. And very often, when you talk about being an MD in a global bank, people automatically assume I'm degree educated. I'm not. I started work at 18. A lot of people assume I was public school educated. I'm not. I went to probably an average comprehensive at best. But that's one of the reasons I'm really keen on diversity. As I've progressed through my career, I've had some great opportunities to work across the UK. And moving from quite a white working class town in South Wales, and then working in other parts of the UK, started broadening my horizons around the diversity in the UK and the importance that diversity brings to organisations. And as I've been fortunate enough to progress in my career and get to a role where I can influence diversity, it's really become a passion of mine. And I remember a bit of a changed experience for me where I went to a female event. I was invited to go along and became what we call a male ambassador at Barclays. And the only bloke in the room, which was really unusual as a banker. It's normally the other way around, and that was quite an opener for us. And people started talking about different experiences, and that was probably about 10 years ago. And I became a father to a daughter as well as 3 boys, and it's really opened my eyes up. And I had a really moment last week that I thought I'd share with you. So currently I'm mentoring a group of 10 individuals for business and community from across a BAME background. But this really interesting conversation at the start. This is, how do you feel that you're from BAME background and I'm the white bloke mentoring you? We got over that one. And then they said, well, we wouldn't mind somebody from a BAME background coming to talk to us, somebody senior at Barclays that can come and talk to you. Do you know what? I struggled. In an organisation that employs 70,000 people, actually to say, okay, I could name somebody straight like that normally. And that shows you that I think over the 30-year career I've had in banking, we've made progress, but we've still got a hell of a long way to go. And that's the reason I'm here today, to make sure I'm part of that change that we're all excited about.
Ian, thank you so much for sharing there. And thank you, in fact, to all of our panelists for sharing an insight into your personal stories. And I think, if I must say, it's one thing that I just find so heartwarming, and I really hope that everyone else who's listening in today also does, is that when leaders share vulnerabilities and share that they're not perfect, it's very easy to look up at those, what we might have in the olden days perceived as kind of, those white ivory towers, perfect leaders, they have the say in everything. Actually, it's not the case. And so having you 3 remarkable leaders on this panel today, sharing your personal stories and also some of the vulnerabilities and putting it out there that you're not, necessarily perfect. I think it is fantastic. So thank you very much for that indeed. And Campbell, sorry to cut you off there.
No problem at all, Leila. Just listening to your stories and your upbringing made me think back to my own upbringing. And my brother and I were born in Paisley, which, for those of you south of the border, is not Glasgow. But we were raised in what was called a tenement building. Right? And a tenement building means that you go in through the entrance, which is called a close. And you go the close and you go up the stairs to the top, where, of course, my mother must have dragged the prams up the 8 flights of stairs to the top floor flat, where our toilet was in the outside landing and the washing room was in the back garden. You know, so it didn't do us any harm, you know, and my brother and I have done okay. So it's just all a bit of perspective of, you know, what our respective upbringings are. But you never forget where you come from. Never forget your roots.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that's been highlighted so you know, starkly, if you don't mind me saying so, on those intros. Actually, is that we must not judge by what we see on the outside. You know, instantaneously presuming, hey, you know, Ian must have been to a top school and had a great start in life. You know, or you know, Gavin, you know, must be easy now that you're MD of kind of BlackRock and Sanjay, you know, one of the most well-known discrimination charities with background at EY. It's very easy to presume that individuals just landed in these positions. Absolutely not the case, and we're going to find out on this panel that there's been a huge amount of hard work and I'm sure challenges to overcome in order to get to these positions. But without further ado, I'll take us straight into you know, some of the first questions from for this panel. You know, clearly we can see that the world is becoming profoundly more digital, more digitally interconnected, and recent trends in data measurement and social engagement show this as a growing trend, one that absolutely will not be going away anytime soon. What's being measured now, and how much data is enough? Sanjay.
Well, I'll answer the second question first because that's easier, which is how much data is enough? You've probably already got too much, actually. What you've not got enough of is insight. I mean, there's a difference between statistics and stories. Statistics are not stories. And my experience, and this is not specific to football or any particular industry, hopefully my comments will apply across industry, is that we have a lot of data, but we don't always have a lot of insight. And normally for me, it's a bit of a tell. If someone in my organization is asking me, can I have some more data? What they're normally really saying to me is, I don't like what this data is telling me. Surely that's not true. Can you find me some more data that aligns with my anecdotal experience? Because I really don't want to act on this because I can't believe that this is the truth. And so if you are faced with that question of someone asking you for more data, you know, I would say that that's probably a signal to push back. So what data is that's out there? And I come from this not as a D&I professional and not as an HR professional. I was effectively a business unit sponsor for these kinds of initiatives. So, but I think the majority of the data that we have is more around the D than the I. It's much more around measuring diversity. Measuring inclusion is a much more nascent and emergent theme in my opinion. So in terms of measuring diversity, and it's much more around gender and ethnicity, kind of for obvious reasons, because they're easier to collect your base data than other protected characteristics. But then we have, I suppose, the same sets of data, but being collected for maybe three purposes. Maybe being collected to diagnose your issues, to measure your performance on your issues, and maybe a subset to measure your return on investment on those issues. And what kind of data might you be collecting or analysing? Well, you might be collecting stuff around representation, you know, what are you benchmarked to demographically or in your industry, retention, recruitment processes, selection processes, promotion, access to development, pay and benefits, and some of that starts to seep into measuring inclusion because gender pay gap, ethnicity pay gap, those things are kind of crude proxies for measuring spread across an organization and therefore measuring inclusion. Employee engagement, much more, and employee focus groups, much more going into from quantitative to qualitative or quantitative proxies for qualitative. Exit interviews, employer brand surveys, there's lots of surveys, grievances and lawsuits, you know, those are indicators of what the culture is inside your organization. what your customer diversity might look like, and there you might again start doing customer surveys, net promoter scores to see what your brand value is, and you might start looking at your suppliers. So I think that is a broad brush view of actually there's quite an industry in generating data. How much insight you get from that data is another matter. There's probably one other sort of category I've seen, which is program execution and the use of technology in program execution, and that's much more I've seen certainly around innovation projects. As an example, some tools for looking at how do you interrupt bias in team allocations on work projects. So actually having that done, having a primary scoop done by a machine, looking at who's available on the resource schedule, so that you interrupt the senior person saying, I'm going to use that team because that's the team I've always used, and that embeds biases that have already been inherent in the system. And then I suppose actually the last bit is for the future and where we're starting to move to. And actually in some ways this kind of links into Gavin and Gavin's boss, because actually Gavin's ultimate boss is one of the prime movers here, which is Larry Fink, as the CEO of BlackRock. So Larry Fink for the last 3 years, in the investment community has been sending out his letters and been talking about sustainability and long-term value and how we measure intangible value. And that has led to a whole bunch of initiatives, including, I know at my old place at EY, we worked with the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, looking at new ways of measuring intangible value. And a couple of those particular values that are relevant here, they developed a framework. It's very interesting. If you can go and download it from a number of different websites. One was societal value, and one was human value. So in terms of societal value, that, for instance, links into things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, I think goal 10 is reducing inequalities. So you might look at things like your governance bodies and what's the diversity of your primary governance bodies. And then human value might be things like doing things like culture surveys. But and I know I'd started to do some of those kinds of things. One of the things I think that's really interesting, actually, the asset management industry, and I'd be interested in Gavin's view on this, because actually they've been developing these alternate metrics for years and alternate views, and questioning CEOs in earnings calls about stuff. And it's actually the CEOs are going, well, how did you know about that? And that's because they're using other data sources. So, they might be using published engagement surveys and published engagement data, but they're also using things like sentiment analysis on Glassdoor and looking at what people are actually saying and the words that people are saying, and things like social media analysis. So to me, that's the kind of future of where things are going, is how do we measure inclusion rather than just the raw diversity statistics?
Absolutely, and I think that's the amazing thing about the present moment, is literally anyone can take to Glassdoor and start to absolutely give it all, frankly. So being truly inclusive as organisations is absolutely paramount. Gavin and Ian, any thoughts at all following on from what Sanjay said there? Go ahead, Gavin.
Okay. I'll offer a contrarian view first of all. Just to make it interesting, and I'll then just give a view on the asset management industry and data. So I think some strides have been made by some industries in collecting data, and I'm not sure if it's in Sanjay's current role or his previous role working in professional services, but I think professional services firms have probably led the way in collecting data around diversifying characteristics, and it might be because they're full of accountants and they like to crunch numbers. But I would say that other industries are laggards in this regard, and other industries just simply haven't, or have stated that they are unable to collect the data. And I think that's an issue, because how can you measure progress if you don't know where you're starting from? So yeah, I feel that for us, and I think that my own experience in having driven this like ethnic minority, particularly when it comes to Black individuals who are severely underrepresented, most firms that we engage with, they don't know first of all, they don't even know how to start the conversation. Second of all, they don't know, even when they have the conversation, what to do next. And my belief is because they don't have a starting point. Now, whether there is any legal reason why they can't collect the data that we don't know about, I'm not sure. But I think that's a huge issue which needs to be overcome. And perhaps we need to look to other industries, such as the professional services firms, who probably have too much. So I think you've got the other end of the spectrum there.
Indeed.
On the asset management question, I think what's really interesting, what Sanjay is alluded to, is basically thinking about this as value, or the value chain, because you think about it, we've probably got the whole value chain represented, or parts of the value chain represented on this call. So, like Sanjay's previous firm would audit, my firm or some of BlackRock's investment companies. We hold them to account through sitting on their boards, or through stewardship, because we hold their shares. And there's this whole value chain, and I think it really starts to fall down when you think about the diversity across that value chain, because it just can't be in one organization. So you can take an example and say that, well, actually, in the current climate, you're absolutely right. There is now much greater scrutiny over how well firms are treating their employees, but also there's this growing need for firms to start giving back to the communities in which they reside. But how do you measure that? And once you do measure it, what do you actually do with the information that you have to make an investment decision? But we do know that what we're seeing is almost a reframing of what it means to be a good employer. And before, it would have been benefits and pay. Now it's about purpose and values. And I think I really think those things will come to the fore. Personally, I think that's a really good thing. But you come to the question of, like, how can you assess how valuable a company is to its community if you don't understand that community as an industry? Because that community, the thoughts and feelings of that community, is not represented in your business. So you start to unwind a whole heap of problems. And I think we don't know the answer to this yet, but it will create a very interesting environment in which to operate.
Mm-hmm. Very well said indeed, Gavin. And Ian, I wonder your thoughts on this at Barclays.
It's really interesting, because you think about how banking's evolved over the last 10, 15 years. Banks have become data warehouses of their own. You think about it, a high street bank like Barclays will have tens of millions of customers from all those communities that we've just been talking about. And therefore, actually, we can pull data pretty much in every different scenario you can think of. And that's interesting in itself, because sometimes but to Sanjay's point, you pull the data to actually tell you what it wants you to say. Now, you can get some trends from that. And the important thing for us at Barclays is how we use that data to more reflect the communities in which we operate. And particularly when we're talking about employees, that our employee structure reflect those communities in which we're based. And so you can use it for that. But I think, I think data can be overrated, if I'm honest. You don't need to be a big company with millions and millions of lines of data to get some really interesting information. I had a really good example recently where I was looking at our recruitment, and I couldn't understand why we weren't getting a proportion of BAME candidates through to interview stage, even though the application, it looked in line with the country. And then I found out what was happening. There was this human involvement and human bias, even though we'd said to some of our line managers, look, you use the online systems, it's got a really good success rate of making sure there's no unconscious bias, etc. They decided to start overlaying some human bias. So, for example, one of the things they were looking for is, has somebody done a Duke of Edinburgh award? If you had that on your CV, you've got a tick. But Duke of Edinburgh's got its own diversity problem. If you look at Duke of Edinburgh's awards and its diversity statistics, not a huge amount of BAME people that go through Duke of Edinburgh. So the minute you applied that human bias to the data was irrelevant, because you basically have completely eradicated what the data was telling you. And so I think the challenge for society as a whole, and particularly big organizations, but it applies to small businesses as well, and we do talk to small businesses about this, you've got to use the data in its rawest format and then understand what it's telling you, but you still need to have that sense check. you need to still apply what I call that gut instinct to say, is this really telling me what's going on, and what can you actually do with it? And I think my fear for the future, I guess, is around data, is because as a country, as you know, as the world becomes more data orientated, that actually we become so intrinsically focused on what that data tells you, you lose some of that human instinct, which is actually at the center of diversity, that breadth of views that you want. And I think it's a really, really interesting debate to see where actually the world develops over the next 10, 15 years.
Absolutely, it's a very, very valid point there, Ian. Indeed, and I think those that are perhaps risk averse like to rely on this this data business, which I'm absolutely all for. But there comes a point sometimes where it's like, look, take that leap of faith and do it. This is right for humanity. Forget about the data and put it out the window for just a moment. Actually, embrace this because it is the right thing to do. And if not now, frankly, then when? Now, guys, just conscious here of timing, so I'm going to skip to one of the other points that I was very, very keen to ask you all about. But clearly, you're all inclusive leaders, which is wonderful, and you're great role models actually to wider businesses and wider society. But I wonder, how do you use not only data but also social means wisely to be able to demonstrate value to your organizations and indeed to wider society? And to give clarity there, this could be through anything such as social media, which pretty much everyone is on these days. But any other thoughts around these social tech means in addition to the data piece there? Gavin, I'm going to come to you first here on this one, if that's okay.
Sure. So your question is, how else do you demonstrate value and inclusivity outside of data? So what other sources are there available to you?
Absolutely. And look, I'm absolutely not, poo-pooing the data side here at all. But I think when we talk about data, when we talk about, tech and things like this, and in particular, actually, looking, say, at, Sanjay's business, organization, I should say, and in fact, both of yours as well, is actually, there is a lot now that we need to be aware of when it comes to social engagement, especially and I don't have children yet, but when I do, I already am worried about their use of social interaction, because you see, a lot of things that are going on now when it comes to kind of online bullying, and there's been really kind of some very, very saddening facts and statistics out there where young people, and not just young people, but young people are being influenced heavily by what's happening within this virtual world and virtual reality almost, that absolutely think it would be remiss not to talk about social engagement side and whether that has changed in line with what's obviously happening within this world of data that we seem to be drowning in almost at the moment.
Yeah, so really interesting. I mean, I'll use a personal story just to maybe answer that question. So I have spent a long time in the corporate world, in the finance industry, and for a long time I always knew I was the only, or one of the very few number of black people in the industry. And I'll tell you what, you don't need data for that. You just take a walk around the office and you can see it. And I thought and I felt I was being a role model just by being there. And I guess I was to a certain extent, but it's only when I got to a more senior position that I felt that, first of all, that I would have license to do something, but also that I had my head down and I was working really hard. And then I got to I think I've made it. Actually, I hadn't made it at all, but I felt at the time, okay, I've got to at least a juncture. And geez, why am I the only one? Why is there no one ahead of me that I can learn from? Why is there no one next to me? And why is there no one bringing up the rear? So, like, how do you, when at that point, the whole diversity movement really was focused on gender, and it was right at the height of the Me Too movement, and rightly so. But when it came to things around, for example, ethnic diversity, which I felt impacted me, there wasn't even a discussion about it. And I think the challenge of discussing race in the UK is that it's very much a taboo subject, and we feel that we live in this really weird post-racial society where, you look at what happens in the US, and you only need to look at the stories which have come out over the last couple of weeks. you often hear the comments, "Oh, thank God, it's better here." Well, tell you what, guys. Okay, perhaps it's not as the worst situation isn't as bad as the US, but I can write you a list of people who faced similar things as the individual in Central Park. I know I have. And police brutality isn't something which only exists in the US. It exists here, and people in my community have died from it. So when you're trying to discuss issues of race in the UK, it's really fraught with difficulty because we have this view that we are almost past it, or a more tolerant society. So how do I start raising the issues that I'm wrestling with every day without having this really defensive reaction? Well, social media actually, in that regard, worked incredibly well, because what I did and a few other people did is we wrote personal stories. Because the key thing is this lack of empathy or understanding about the challenges that you might face in your life and on a day-to-day basis. And I wrote a story about my experience living in a single-parent family, dealing with knife and gun crime and gangs, and then making it to university, and then realizing that, oh my God, this is a whole different language that I need to learn, never fitting in, being alienated. And it went viral. And it got read at least certainly on social media about 12,000 times in a very, very short period. So here comes the data bit. And then I have people that I've just never met, will approach me and say, "Oh, I read your article. It got sent to me, not via social media or LinkedIn as it was, but it was a PDF that kind of went around the US of all places." So I think there was no way that, and that I felt was a watershed moment in my industry, and maybe for a lot of people, because they felt they were able to be vulnerable. They felt they were able to start discussing things. And I've seen a whole host of people writing personal stories about their experience as a gay person, or someone who has an autistic son or daughter, or being Black or Asian, and that's fantastic. So I think when I come full circle back to Sanjay's point, which is it's very easy to distill discussion down into numbers. Actually, the data that you need, I absolutely agree, is qualitative. So what's this person's lived experience? What are they going through? Because without that, it becomes very, very difficult to look behind the numbers and assess what's really going on.
Thanks ever so much for sharing there, Gavin. And first must say, look, everyone loves a great PDF. I absolutely do. So that going around the States is remarkable. But I absolutely concur, most importantly, with personal stories, because it is those personal stories, and in specific those from leaders who actually allow others to feel comfortable enough to be able to be them true selves, and to actually be able to open up to bring their selves their full selves to work. Ian and Sanjay, do you have any further comments or thoughts on some of the things that Gavin's mentioned there?
So I think what's interesting around data is around the integrity of data, and I was just reflecting there as Gavin was talking, because when you look at data, you're reliant on people actually providing surveys, using data, and understanding that. And look, a lot of this data that's out there is based on employee surveys, based on people ticking a box that specifies, I'm from a BAME background. And I always remember early on in my career, we did a staff survey, and it came back that my team were 100% white Christian, which was a bit strange because I knew I had an Asian Muslim in my team. And I went up to him and said, "Well, did you complete the survey? Because it is anonymous." He said, yeah, but I didn't tick that box, because if I ticked that box, you'd know it was me. Even though the responses were anonymous, so I couldn't have targeted it. And it came back about a couple of months ago. I had a really good discussion, and Gavin, I was thinking about you when you were saying this, but about how do you bring yourself to work? And it's quite prevalent in the financial services industry, because if you said to somebody, "What does a banker look like?" or "How do you have to behave?" people articulate that persona that you've got to be. And when we were talking to a lot of our BAME colleagues, they were saying, actually, even when it comes to surveys, they sometimes tick the boxes because they think it's the answer that you want. And the danger with that then is you use the data based on a false start. that people aren't truly reflecting. So I think one of the challenges you've got with data and diversity is really understanding, do people feel comfortable the way the data is going to be used, and therefore it will give you a realistic result? Because if they think there's a bias in the data, or they think there's a way of being targeted, or they think you will perceive them differently, they'll ask the questions differently, and therefore your data is worthless. And I think that's a real challenge for a lot of the diversity statistics that we look at. You've got to sit behind thinking, okay, actually, unless this is a big anonymous survey, there's going to be some bias going on here. Interesting.
Yeah.
When we move from gender to looking at ethnicity, it's much more prevalent in ethnicity. People really think about, actually, how do I answer that box, that I'm asked to complete. So I think look, it's one to keep an eye out of, especially when we look at the data.
Could I just say one more thing then, because I think that's fascinating, and I'm not surprised, because first and foremost, like your minority colleagues, they're probably wearing a mask and adapting to what the corporate environment is every single day. So they are not unlikely that they're bringing their whole selves to work, because I know, like, I'm 6'3". As soon as I walk into a room, like, people would notice me if I was blonde haired and blue eyed. Definitely going to notice me because I'm a 6'3" black guy. So there are certain traits that you take on. I have to make myself smaller. I smile so much because people, if they see me, they're like, okay, who's this? They want to be threatening. If there's a discussion in the office, it can never get heated from my perspective, because I have to never ever raise my voice. So with all that, then you get sent a survey. There's no way that those individuals are going to actually give their real thoughts. And the key thing before you start gathering that data, therefore, is, have you taken the steps to really build trust with the population that you're trying to understand? Yeah. Have you actually sat down, said to them, look, a survey is coming out. I really need you as a population to answer as truthfully, because I need to understand what it's like for you working in my organization. And you might have that conversation once. You're not going to get the right answer, the real answers, the true answers the first time round. It's going to take a long time to build that trust, because it's probably been eroded over years and years and years. So I absolutely agree. There's a danger in just looking at the data and taking it at face value without having the discussions beforehand.
Leila, can I just pick up, because I think you were asking about social media and social technology, and it's probably something I grapple with a lot now, and a lot more in football, because it's such a hot issue in football. But actually, it is as a society, and so I go back to, if you know Marshall McLuhan, sort of 50s, 60s, 70s. He was a media philosopher. He wrote books like The Medium is the Message. He had this theory that each new form of media, the first iteration of any new form of media, is essentially a pale imitation of the previous medium. So as an example, the very first forms of television were effectively televised radio programs. It took a while for it to find its natural voice. Well, actually, that's what we're experiencing, because social media is the internet age finding its voice. It's finding its natural communication mechanism, because email was effectively an electronic version of what we were always doing for 50, 60 years beforehand. So the reality is, we don't know the rules of the road and the etiquette around how to handle social media. And that's what all of us as a society are grappling with. There are bad things, and often it's the bad things that gets the news, particularly in my current industry in football. There's lots of that. But there's also some good things about it. We would never have found out about the abuse with the Yeovil fans at a non-league ground. We found out about that within minutes, because it went like wildfire on social media. And so what we all have to grapple with is, how do we police, manage, monitor, deal with activity on social media? From a corporate perspective, when I was in the corporate world, it's effectively, we're all corporate ciphers. We just peddle the corporate message, very tedious stuff. I know people think it's really interesting content, but it's not really. It's not. It's not that engaging, right? But our young people we want to police them because we want them to be the corporate cyborgs. So we want them into behaving in a particular way. They're not going to do that. They're just not going to do that. They're going to behave. They are born and brought up on social media, and they will interact the way that they've been brought up to interact on it. And actually, it's us that's got to change. We've got to change how we deal with that. And I think that is a big challenge / opportunity.
I absolutely concur there, Sanjay. It is a challenge, but absolutely, let's look at things with the glass half full perspective and lens on, and look at how we can, really utilise, the silver lining that comes out of that. And I love the term there that you use as well, corporate cyborg. That's brilliant. I will be reusing that again happily. But guys, just conscious here of timings. I'm being told by the team that we need to wrap very soon, and we've had a plethora of questions that actually come from the live floor in the summit itself. Obviously, those who are streaming in on Yahoo Finance or via any of the brand advanced publications, I'm afraid you can't ask questions, but you can write to us. So I'm going to pose a quick question here to all of you, and I'm literally going to give you around about 30 seconds to a minute. No, sorry, 45 seconds each to answer this. The importance on allyship. I absolutely critically believe this is so important, because everyone has got a part to play when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Your thoughts on allyship?
It's a good start, but you need to be an advocate. It's not. It's in a world that, for example, taking racism, in a world where racism exists, it's not good enough to be an ally. You have to be an anti-racist.
Yeah, I agree. And sorry, Ian can go ahead.
Sorry, Gavin.
Sorry, Ian, I cut you off. I agree, and I also think that what you often find is that it's the minority groups advocating for themselves. So effectively, they're trying to fix their own problems, which is absurd, because they are a minority, meaning that they don't have the influence and the platform or the ability to change things. So I would like to see much more, I couldn't agree more, advocacy from the majority. And if you're uncomfortable saying the word Black or Asian, try being Black or Asian and living in a very, very white environment. So maybe you know how we feel.
Very well said, indeed, Gavin. And very quickly on that point, for minority groups in specific, there's no point preaching to the converted, right? It's not going to change anything at all if we all sit around in a huddle and complain about things. This is absolutely about embracing all and looking at this in a more holistic way, where everyone is involved, visible diversities or invisible diversities that sit below the surface level. Finally, to you, Ian.
Look, I think allyship is really important. I see the ally roles I play actually as an education role for me. Whatever ally role, would be gender, ethnicity, etc. I think also there's an interesting debate to have around the word role model as well, to take that advocacy a bit further. Do you need to be part of that community to be a role model in that community? It's something that's obviously misunderstood, and I think actually being able to talk and share your experiences and why it's important actually is quite a role model behaviour as well. And I think that's where some of the debate needs to go on. I think the ally network was a great thing to start with, but for all the reasons just articulated, it's got a long way to go.
Absolutely. Long may it continue. And I should say as well, Ian, thank you ever so much for being on our DAL Global Advisory Board as well. You've been a real true support. So thank you. And thank you very much indeed to our other panelists as well. Sanjay, Gavin, Ian, you've all been remarkable, and it's been very inspirational, if I must say, for you being here and sharing those stories.